without any further ado, the Second Vatican Council. Are there any questions about the syllabus that I sent out? Did anybody? Yeah, there was a lot there, but that's what you've gotten yourselves into. So, and I guess it's important to say from the beginning that I am in no way super knowledgeable about much to do with the Second Vatican Council. All right, and what I mean by that is the title of the course is The Theology of the Second Vatican Council. I can talk about theology for a while, I'm okay there. But if you want accounts of a lot of the names and the figures and the important moments and the backroom political negotiations, if you really want a historical account of what happened with the Second Vatican Council, I'm not going to be as strong there. Some of that's going to come up. It's going to come up in our readings. Okay, I'll mention it. There are a couple of really essential moments where people were having backroom political negotiations that immediately impacted the theology that was produced by the council. But if you're looking for a really concrete historical account, this is not where I'm going to be at my strongest, okay? But we can try. So that's my first and most important disclaimer. I'll be doing a lot more with theology than I will be with history, okay? And that also includes, importantly, sort of the effects of the council. We're going to spend 2 classes talking about sort of what comes from the council, and the primary focus there will be theological. So we'll be talking about ideas and theories, but a little bit less about issues on the ground. And that's going to be probably a little bit frustrating for all of us because the issues on the ground are some of what drives us the most and maybe drives us the most crazy. We want to talk about why did this happen in this particular diocese or that particular church, and we're not going to do so much of that, okay? So we're going to more or less stay at the level of theology, but we'll take some dives into history when we need to. All right? Any questions there? Super important also, as far as the reading goes, and I've said this a few times, there are resources that I'm going to send out every week of secondary sources, right? So people talking about the primary documents, and they're there as resources for you. They've been chosen because I think they're very good, and I think they're very helpful, and I think they're more or less accessible with some time and attention, but the key here is to try and get everyone to read these documents. So this is really what I'm hoping for, and we're not going to get there for 2 more weeks, so if you want to get a head start, you can. These are beautiful documents. You could do as well to read these sitting in the chapel in prayer as you could to read them at a desk where you do your research and your writing and your emails and whatever it is that occupies your time. So there's just so much richness in here. This is what we're hoping everybody reads. There's a dog. So,
sorry, I thought we were still having coffee and donuts.
No. Pastor's late to class. So,
These are all these people not moving.
All right. Never a dull moment.
Bye, Klaus.
All right. Bye, Klaus.
Bye, Father.
So, all right. Back to being serious. So every class will start more or less like this after Mass, okay? We'll roll in. I will not have coffee and donuts at every meeting, but maybe for some of the meetings, okay? But the tables are out here so that you guys have some space to work. Bring coffee, bring whatever. It's good, right? What else matters? The reading, the timing will always finish by 10, okay? If not a little bit before. And I'm going to try to keep the lectures sort of at the level of just taking what's most essential about what the reading is and trying to just get that to you. So if you aren't up with the readings, if the readings were challenging, I'm just giving you the essential points. So most of what you'll get from me is going to be in this stuff, okay? And so that means you have access to it. You can read it as many times as you'd like. It's super enriching. Okay? Good? So today and next week, we are going to try and get just a snapshot of the life of the church before the Second Vatican Council. Today, we are talking about three sort of themes to pay attention to before 1962, when the Second Vatican Council opens. And those themes are church government, liturgical reform and or renewal, depending on how you understand that. And I call it like the post-World War II malaise in Europe, all right? And each of those themes is important in its own way, and they connect together. If some of the folks here did our study on the Protestant Reformation last semester, and I liked how that the text we read talked about like narrative threads that together intertwine to give an account of what's going on with the modern world. And I like that metaphor. I think it's helpful. And these first two classes are really to identify four narrative threads that kind of give us this like snapshot of the church before the Second Vatican Council. So church government and liturgical reform or renewal, and then sort of the atmosphere, the spiritual atmosphere, in particular in Europe after the Second World War. And then next week will be theology. What's going on with theology? I'll do my best work there, but today is to try and cover those first three. All right? So in terms of church government, the reading that I sent out for anybody who had the time to go through it was by John W. O'Malley. John O'Malley is a Jesuit priest. He is brilliant. He is in retirement in Baltimore. I'm told that he is as sharp as he has ever been, but very frail. So maybe at some point I will go look him up at the Jesuit retirement home on Roland Avenue and see if I can get him up here. That could be fun. John O'Malley is an expert on the Second Vatican Council, and he wrote a book that is listed in the syllabus, What Happened at Vatican II, which is very good. It's an excellent resource. If you're interested in the historical events and the nuances of the council, that's the book for you, okay? It's a good one to have, and it's eminently readable, okay? He wrote it for us. It's not written for graduate students or college professors. So O'Malley's book is really good. This essay was published in Church Life Journal. There are going to be a lot of readings that come out of Church Life Journal. Church Life Journal is, and you'll see it here, a journal of the McGrath Institute for Church Life. This is out of the University of Notre Dame. They do outstanding work. If you're looking for a place, everybody has their blog sites these days, or they like to go and get a think piece or two and kind of pick up on what's going on out there in the world. Church Life Journal produces excellent quality analysis. It's really beautiful. They have, I think without a doubt, the best minds in the American church, or at least or even the English-speaking church, regularly publishing on their website. And John O'Malley, a few years ago, puts this essay out on the impacts of the First Vatican Council on the life of the church. So to say that we are going to begin understanding the church before Vatican II with Vatican I is somewhat arbitrary. How do you make a decision about where to pick up history ever? That there are methods, there are ways we could try to answer that question. But we're going with Vatican I because, as if you've read the article, as O'Malley describes, major changes in the structure of the church occurred because of, one, the documents at the First Vatican Council that were produced, the two documents, and two, sort of contingent political, cultural, social, and economic developments in Europe at the time. And in that sense, they just sort of dovetailed together into this like perfect storm that permanently altered the church and created, in many ways, the church that we know, okay? So that's why we're going to go through this essay, because I think it's very helpful. O'Malley begins with these three basic points that are pertinent to our topic. remember these, okay? Because when we finish working through the documents of the Second Vatican Council, and then we're trying to take stock of what happened after the council, how do we explain all of this? These 3 rules that O'Malley gives here are very helpful for understanding how any one historical event impacts the world, okay? So don't forget these. I'm not going to go through them, but this is helpful. I'll probably circle back to them at the end of April when we get finished with the council documents. All right. So O'Malley, the main point he is trying to make is that regarding centralization in the life of the church, centralization of authority. Authority in the church comes basically in 2 forms. There's teaching authority and there's governing authority. And they oftentimes go hand in hand, more so now than ever, but teaching authority and governing authority. And O'Malley's point is that with the First Vatican Council and developments in Europe, teaching authority and governing authority in the church changed somewhat permanently. It hasn't reverted back to how it was before yet. Perhaps it could, but that hasn't happened. So what I want to do is just start by developing a little bit more what O'Malley does here. He starts really talking about the history of the church by talking about the beginning of the church and how teaching and governing authority existed in the church in the first few centuries. All right? And just to make this as simple as possible, for about the first 300 or 400 years of the church, if you were to ask anybody, what is the most important, and we'll use the word diocese, what is the most important diocese in the world for Christians? Rome would probably not have made the list of the top 3. Most Christians probably would have said Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria. Antioch and Alexandria were absolutely the intellectual centers of Christianity for the first few hundred years of the church. They had competing visions and understandings of how we are to relate to God and what God has done. So Antioch and Alexandria did not agree. They fought perpetually for a few centuries. And Constantinople, ultimately, because of contingent developments in the Roman Empire, Constantinople becomes the seat of political authority in the Western world. And so that becomes the most important sort of political authority within the life of the church as well. The archbishop, the metropolitan of Constantinople, had a lot of power and a lot of influence, and in many ways more so than the Bishop of Rome. But what happens is the political disputes and the theological disagreements that are driving controversy in the church are slowly but surely being adjudicated by the Bishop of Rome. Various metropolitan bishops, various church leaders intuitively know and recognize that the successor of Peter has a particular amount of authority that is not reserved for other bishops. And so the church starts to look toward Rome to settle disagreements, to settle disputes. This is different from the Bishop of Rome governing the church. The Bishop of Rome isn't telling everybody out there who's a Christian how to live or how the church should be structured. Nor is the Bishop of Rome teaching the whole of Christianity like what is true, okay? He's not exercising that kind of authority. But the Bishop of Rome slowly but surely begins to settle disputes. And a really good example of how this works is at the Council of Chalcedon in the middle of the 5th century, when things were very bad for the church and there was profound disagreement in regards to who is Jesus. No one agreed. Who is Jesus? And what was Jesus' life like? And that's a really big deal. I mean, it's important for us to understand who Jesus is and what his life is like. So, I always say, in many ways, what we fight about today pales in comparison to what Christians were fighting about 15, 16, 1700 years ago, okay? The Bishop of Rome at the time writes this really long letter, it's called the Tome of Flavian, to a bishop in Constantinople, just sort of laying out some of his thoughts. And that letter from Rome to Constantinople becomes the sort of source of resolution of the debate. Because everybody says, you know what? If Peter is speaking at this time in this way, we should really pay attention, okay? So there's this beautiful way in which the church is very decentralized for the first several hundred years of her life. Decentralized. Lots of power, lots of authority is spread out amongst various important metropolitan sees, or dioceses is the word we use today, all right? Power is diffuse. And the Bishop of Rome helps settle controversy. That's basically what the Bishop of Rome does. For about 400 or 500 years, until the Roman Empire really does collapse. And the church inherits even more power and authority for herself. And we start to build up Christendom, really, for, it's an anachronistic term. They wouldn't have understood exactly that way at the time, but they're building up Christendom. And we'll get to this when we talk about the Ratzinger piece at the end of today's class, but you get to what Joseph Ratzinger describes as an identification of church and world in the medieval period. So, the world is the church, and the church is the world. The church has become so, intertwined with politics and culture and society, there is no way to distinguish between, who I am as a Christian and Roman Catholicism. It's just the air everyone is breathing, okay? And with that development of sort of identification between church and world, the world becoming Catholic, comes more political authority for the Bishop of Rome. But O'Malley makes this point that authority in Rome was always bound up with secular political authority. Secular political authority. Emperors and kings and princes and lords were happy to work with the Pope, and in many cases, just gave in to the demands of the Holy Father, but they always retained some amount of authority over the church for themselves. And in an important way, that authority was exercised by secular leaders in the choice of bishops, okay? And this is called lay investiture in the history of the church. Who gets to choose bishops? Who gets to appoint bishops? This is obviously a very important matter, right? I mean, we have an understanding of how important bishops are, and our whole understanding of how people become bishops is the modern understanding of how people become bishops. So the folks in Rome keep a list, and people's names are on it, and the church selects her next generation of leaders. But for centuries upon centuries, up until the 20th century, various rulers in Europe retained the right to nominate or name bishops. Popes generally could veto those names, but at political cost. It wasn't a consequence-free decision to veto a recommendation for a bishop from the Holy Roman Emperor, okay? So the church doesn't have so much control over her own life. And by her own life, I mean her liturgy and her prayer and her governing structure, okay? And even at times her theology. The secular world was always sort of involved in how the church was living. And O'Malley's point is, because of a couple of things that the First Vatican Council says, and because of some historical developments in Europe in the mid to late 19th century, we finally get to a place where church and world become pretty separated from one another again. In particular, the church is able to breathe on her own without depending on approval from secular leaders or rulers out there in the world, all right? So Does that make sense to you guys? All right, this is sort of the broad contour development of like structure and authority in the church over the last 2,000 years. So O'Malley's main point is that since the First Vatican Council, we're looking at a centralizing process in church governance. Okay, I like if you printed this out on the bottom of page 3, O'Malley gives what I think is an important rule for understanding the life of the church. So, and importantly, the Second Vatican Council as well. He writes that is, this is the very bottom paragraph on that third page, that is, it is virtually impossible to disentangle a council's impact from the cultural and socio-political context in which it happens. We again remind ourselves, once concluded, a council has no control over how it is interpreted and over what its repercussions might be. A council's decisions are reshaped and refashioned according to the milieu in which they are received. So keep that in mind when we start talking about what happens after Vatican II, because when the council concludes, and now the council is in the hands of everyone out there in the world as they try to make sense of what just happened, what was just taught. Okay, so that's a point of like interpretation. It's a good sort of principle to keep with us in mind. Now, O'Malley identifies what I think are 7 consequences for the life of the church that come out of the First Vatican Council and its teaching on papal infallibility in particular. Okay, so he's talking about papal infallibility. And this is the idea that the Pope speaks with a certain amount of authority when he speaks from the chair of St. Peter. Okay, and remember, in the first, 1,800 years of the life of the church, popes didn't really do that. They settled disputes. Okay, but they didn't teach from the chair of Peter with the kind of authority that we would attribute to a magisterium, okay, like an ecumenical council. Popes didn't speak with the same kind of authority, seemingly, that the Council of Constantinople spoke with, or Nicaea, right? Like, there was a clear difference. Popes might write, popes might say some things, but when councils come together, like the spirit is alive and everything is changing and there is like a dynamism there. And now in the 19th century, we're starting to see the church understanding that the successor of St. Peter also wields that kind of authority in particular times, in particular ways, okay? So that's a big change. And that, bound up with the social, political, and cultural upheaval in Europe, results in these 7 consequences for our church that O'Malley identifies. So here are the 7, okay? I'm going to read right from the essay. Number 1, these events gave the popes power to shape the worldwide episcopacy that they had never had before. And he says, importantly, this happened after Pastor Aeternus, but it did not happen because of it. Okay, so this is contingent. But the point here is that because of the changes on the ground in Europe, the church became liberated from secular authority. And lots of good potentially came from that. So that now, whoever is the ruler of Italy or France or Spain does not get to choose who becomes the bishop of Naples or Milan or Madrid, right? Like, this is good. Maybe. It could be good. It had never been the case before. Maybe we don't like that. And that's the second point that O'Malley makes. Nonetheless, what was lost because of this development was an effective lay voice, okay? A voice for the laity in the selection of leadership in the church. Without secular authority having any amount of influence on the selection of bishops, everything was left in the hands of the bishops. And O'Malley refers to this as a form of clericalism. It just, to become a bishop was a matter settled by other bishops, which, again, maybe that's good or maybe it's not. There are many ways we could interpret that development, but the change is substantive. The third consequence In any case, in this way and in others, Pastor Aeternus, this is the document of the First Vatican Council, was just one factor in promoting an ever more vivid Pope consciousness among Catholics around the world. I tell people this all the time. Maybe I've told you before. For everybody who gets anxious about what, any particular Pope is saying or doing, adopt your 10th century mindset where probably you were like 2 or 3 popes behind in your awareness of who was leading the church. All right? We have access to information now about what's happening in Rome that is literally unfathomable for most of the history of Christianity. And it's eminently frustrating for us to worry and become anxious about what's going on in Rome. But that was never the case for most Christians most of the time. And also, they didn't, per se, care so much about who the Holy Father was or what he was doing. I mean, it wasn't as important. Your church was far more local, maybe national, but usually local. If we were alive in the 17th century, and, imagine the church was up and running then in this country, the Archbishop of Baltimore would be it for us. That would be all there is to say about it, Does that, kind of make sense? It's just... Pope consciousness is a modern phenomenon. And now, our understanding of the church is utterly dominated by who is the Holy Father. But this is a development that's only about 150 years old. It's fascinating. In a 2,000-year-old church, we've only been doing this for about 15 decades. And so who's to say if this is good or if this is problematic? The fourth consequence. This acute Pope awareness helped foster the idea, suggested indeed by, again, this document, that the Vatican is the source from which everything flows, rather than the center where everything comes together, all right? This is about a tension between the peripheral and the center. And O'Malley's contention, his claim, is that for most of the history of the church, everybody might look to Rome to see how the church was holding together, but it wasn't that the church in Rome told everyone else how to live and move and have their being, right? That's just not how it worked. Authority in Rome was about adjudication more than teaching and more than governing, all right? But because of the Pope consciousness, this awareness of the Holy Father and his importance, now we start to see that, now, all that matters to us as Christians, as Roman Catholics, is coming out of Rome, right? And isn't this not how we see the church? I mean, we're just hanging in suspense, waiting to see what Rome is going to tell us about whatever. That's not how the church sort of lived for 1,500 years. The teaching and governing decisions would come out of Rome, but you wouldn't pick up on them for, maybe a century. There was this lag time. So that's the fourth consequence. The fifth is, I'm calling this a question, a lack of certainty about authority in the church that develops. So this is at the bottom of the fourth page, I think. O'Malley writes that Pastor Aeternus in its totality, but especially chapter 4 on infallibility, gave rise to the persuasion that it made even future ecumenical councils superfluous. So there was ambiguity because of the teaching on papal infallibility. Well, if the Pope can speak with this kind of authority, what good or what purpose do ecumenical councils serve? So if the Pope now can speak with the same amount of authority as the whole of the church gathered together under the leadership of the Spirit is able to speak with, why do we need councils at all? And that's still, I think, a live question in many ways. We've sort of, at the level of practice, resolved that question because the Second Vatican Council has happened, right? So, we're still going to be doing councils. And we're still doing synods, right? We're in the midst of one right now. So on the ground level, we've resolved that ambiguity because we're still doing what we've been doing for 2,000 years. We're calling councils, we're getting people together, we're having conversations. But I think at the level of theory, that's still an open question. How do you establish the balance between forms of teaching and governing authority within the life of the church? All right? That make sense? The fifth, center of the next page, chapter 4 of Pastor Aeternus, imbued papal statements, moreover, with a new dignity and doctrinal weight, even when they made no claims to infallibility. So, along with increasing Pope consciousness comes increasing care about what the Pope is saying. So not only do you start to look to the guy more and more as a source of leadership in the church, but you also just want to know what he's saying, you know? It's astounding to me. I think, I don't know, the tradition of a papal audience, you know, St. Peter wasn't walking out there giving papal audiences once a week to the people in Rome, you know? So this is newer in the history of the church, and sort of the weight that something like the John Paul II's theology of the body carries in the church today is astounding, given the fact that these were just like 5-minute reflections that the guy gave once a week over the course of his service as the Holy Father. I mean, that's just not something that would have happened a few hundred years ago, you know? It wasn't even part of a mass, you know? They were like, he just walked out and shared some of his ideas. And like, look, they're carefully worked out, they're beautiful, they're profound and insightful, and I think inspired. But it's just such a new phenomenon that casual remarks offered by the Holy Father nowadays, like in like Catholic universities, carry like teaching authority. It's just that never would have happened 1,000 years ago. So this is all very new. The sixth consequence is that the Holy Father and the Vatican starts to just pump out more documents than ever before. And O'Malley gives some statistics about, so this is Leo the 13th publishes 75 encyclicals in his career. 75. That's an astounding number of encyclicals. And it leads to some tension, I think, in the church, too, about, like, how do you rank levels of teaching authority in the church? So, there's dogma. Don't mess with dogma, or you're out, okay? There's doctrine. Don't mess with doctrine, or you're out. Now there's an encyclical. Well, they say that comes with teaching authority, so you probably shouldn't mess with encyclicals. All right, but what about an apostolic exhortation, which is less than an encyclical, but more than a homily given at the Easter Vigil Mass by the Pope, okay? And how does an audience carry weight in comparison to the homily? And then now we have, the statements on the papal plane, so, we have these unresolved, in a sense, questions about daily life in the church now, because increasing Pope consciousness has led to increasing Roman consciousness, which has led to Rome taking itself more seriously than it had in the past. And so there's just more being put out regarding everything we're called to know and understand and believe, okay, and experience as Christians. And that's just very different for the church, okay? And the seventh and final, and this is big, the popes moved from being primarily judges to being teachers. All right? And that's kind of where we started talking about history, okay? From judges to teachers. If you try to look up encyclicals from before the 19th century, you're not going to find much that inspires you, and you won't be being taught much. Popes might have written a document to settle an argument, but they were not working out like profound teachings of the faith. That's not what they did. They had theologians for that. They had specially chosen bishops for that. But it wasn't what they did, okay? So that's what I want you to understand about governance of the church after the First Vatican Council, okay? A centralizing movement that is increasingly Roman, that comes along with a vitalized papal consciousness on the part of the faithful, and leads to a change in teaching authority in the church. Okay? Good? All right. We out of time yet? Let's see. What time is it? My phone's not working. 9:15. Oh, plenty of time. All right. Liturgical renewal. So this is the essay by Roland Miller. This, I picked this mostly because this is such an important movement in the history of the church. It's called just the liturgical movement. So the title's simple. But it was hard to find a good essay that covered like the history of the liturgical movement in the church. My buddy up at Mount St. Mary's found this on the Notre Dame like academic server and sent it to me, and I said, well, this will get the job done. Don't hate me, but I really only wanted you to guys read like 4 pages. But there's so much richness here, and you're going to have a better understanding of Dom Virgil Michel now. Most guys out there don't have that, and now you have that gift. So you're welcome.
Thank you, buddy.
The liturgical movement is so important, and I'm talking about liturgy because, of course, we know, right? Maybe some of you like have memories of like what Mass looked like, in a bygone age. But I don't. But I've heard tell, and liturgy changes after the Second Vatican Council, and that's an essential point of controversy today. It hasn't been resolved. So we're going to talk about liturgical renewal, and what I want you to basically understand is that the Second Vatican Council is a part of something that is much larger in the history of the Church. So this was not the case that a bunch of folks got together in Rome and decided it was time to change everything. This had been a movement developing for 2 centuries, essentially, by the time the Second Vatican Council makes some changes regarding liturgy. Now, we're not going to really talk about any of those changes. We're going to get to that later. We're going to read Sacrosanctum Concilium, all right, which is the Vatican II document on the liturgy. You're going to read that. You'll probably be amazed by some of what that says. I'm probably going to have a guest lecturer come in for that one because I do not know much about liturgical reform in the church, and I'm not like a liturgist. I can do liturgy, but like I'm not like really well versed there. So my good friend's down at the cathedral. He knows about the liturgy. Liturgy is his passion. He wrote his MA thesis on liturgy, essentially. So I'll probably have him come up and he'll talk to you guys about that. So sort of hold your thoughts or questions about like what happens to the liturgy until we get there, I think in the middle of March. All right. But the problem here is that, and it's in this document started on page, if you're the pagination of the essay 132, sort of the liturgical movements. We get to this need. Now I'm on page 134. This is where I underlined it. It's just Pius X is the Holy Father in the early 20th century, and he becomes really passionate about sacred music in the liturgy. This happens because there is a diagnosed absence of active participation of all people in the liturgy. Now, if you ask most like Catholics what active participation means in the liturgy, you're probably going to just like, well, everyone should be singing, and maybe everyone should be saying, and with your spirit more and loudly, right? But that's a really reductive understanding of participation, all right? The problem that is identified in the liturgical life of the church is that Christians have become overly devotional, essentially. And maybe if you remember the liturgy before the Second Vatican Council, you'll have memories, and like I've seen people do it, where they go into church for Mass and they kneel down and they're just praying rosaries all the way through, okay? All the way through. That's not participation in the sacred liturgy of the church. I remember going down to Guatemala and the most astounding popular devotions to the saints you would ever see. Street processions, like all of it, right? And I mean, children, families gathered around statues of the Blessed Virgin Mother in their homes and praying in these beautiful ways, and then like they don't go to Mass. And that's a real problem. The liturgy is the source and summit of the Christian life. And not only were many Christians not going to Mass regularly, but even when they were there, they weren't engaged. And that's problematic. Deeply problematic. In addition to that, I think it's important, I'll just spend a minute here. The liturgy in the history of the church has always been very diverse. Very diverse. We talk about the Roman Rite, all right, which becomes sort of the style of liturgy in our tradition. But there's a Byzantine Rite and an Ambrosian Rite and a Syro-Malabar Rite, like all of these different ways of doing liturgy. One of the big problems, and this goes along with the struggle over the life of the church with political authority, one of the big challenges was that kingdoms or countries developed their own liturgies. And this essay talks about the Gallican influence on the church. So these monks in Belgium, in what is now Belgium, in the early 19th century, are looking at the liturgy and they're saying, you know what, this has just become so French. Like, there's nothing universal about this. And who are we to start adding things to Mass because a king says so, right? Or this particular cardinal desires that something different happen. There's also the fact that liturgy had become a little inaccessible to people. I mean, most people weren't speaking Latin, and if you see an extraordinary form Mass, the priest is saying lots of things to himself. And so the lack of participation wasn't just a consequence of over-devotion on the part of the people, but like you walked into church for Mass, you had no idea what was being said, you weren't seemingly like invited to be a part of it, and you had time to kill. So you prayed rosaries, for 2 hours on a Sunday. And that's not liturgy, The church, I mean, it's so much has happened in the last 150 years that we haven't come to terms with yet as a church. I don't, the rule is that everyone goes to confession one time during the Easter season, and also receive the Eucharist, because people weren't going. Like, Mass, why would I go to Mass, for 1,000 years? Why would I, I'll try to get there once, but that's what the nuns do, the monks, they do Mass. But, I have a devotion to Saint Asquith or whatever, and that's where I spend all of my time, and that's not the church. So this renewal movement or reform movement, the words matter, I suppose, begins in the early 19th century at the Abbey of Salem in what is now Belgium, and this abbot Guaranger wants to make liturgical life the very center of his community. And so he starts trying to strip out sort of the unnecessary influences on what Mass looks like to get the liturgy back down to the simple beauty of the Roman Rite, okay? And we'll talk about some of those more, what does that mean in particular later. But he's trying to just get Mass down to its simple beauty again. That leads to a desire to engage the faithful more in Mass. When Pope Pius X is writing about sacred music, he's doing it because to return to Gregorian chant is a way of involving the people in Mass again. I think one way to understand this, if you guys come to our 7:30 Mass on Sundays, we do a simple chant, and it's called an antiphonal response, okay? And so we're just singing the same simple line from Scripture again and again and again. In a world in which there's no access to hymnals, okay, how are you supposed to sing anything if you don't have it written out in front of you and it's in a language you don't understand? Well, that kind of Gregorian chant is really helpful because you can get sense of the repetition within it, right? And it just draws you in more compared to whatever else is out there. There's a simple beauty to it that's engaging and inviting. And the church starts to say, we should do this more. This is our history. This is our legacy, right? So let's get the people back and engaged in Mass. The central point here, he's quoting Louis Bouillet, who is an incredibly important influence on the Second Vatican Council. We'll probably talk about him a little bit later. But so in Bouillet's estimation, this is on the bottom of page 134, Bedouin, this guy they're talking about, strengthened the foundation laid by Gallinger by articulating this essential idea, that we must not try to provide an artificial congregation to take part in an antiquarian liturgy, okay? So artificial congregation, people who happen to be there praying rosaries, all right? Antiquarian liturgy, a mass that does not involve them at all because it's just very old, but rather to prepare the actual congregations of the church today to take part in the truly traditional liturgy rightly understood. In other words, the goal of the liturgical movement was not initially or principally ritual reform. It was not about changing Mass, okay? That was not the objective of liturgical renewal in the church, to change Mass, to change the direction the priest faces when he's saying Mass, to change the language of the Mass. That is not what any of these leaders in the church wanted, all right? It was not ritual reform. In continuity with Pius, the focus of the movement was promoting active participation. We wanted you to be a part of the Mass that we were praying, okay? And to know that you were a part of it and to be praying with us. In its later years, members of the liturgical movement would concentrate on ritual reforms. So eventually we end up talking about ritual reform anyway. What gets changed in Mass? But that happened later. That's not where renewal of liturgical life in the church began. Initially, however, the primary concentration was the formation and education of the faithful so they could fully and actively worship God during the liturgy. That's what is happening in the church in these really important, conduits of influence for a little over a century before the start of the Second Vatican Council. It begins in the early 19th century at that Abbey of Salem in Belgium, and it keeps going through the lives of some really influential abbots and monks. By the time you get to the early 20th century, mid to early 20th century, you have this really important figure in Germany, Romano Guardini, okay? He'll probably come up later as well. Deeply influential theologian and liturgist, okay? Guardini is magnificent. If you're looking for a good book to read for Lent, for spiritual nourishment, read his Life of Christ, The Lord. It's called The Lord. It's so overwhelmingly good that I tried to read it on a retreat once, 7 days in silence, and 7 days didn't do justice to more than a couple of chapters. It's that good. So, Guardini is incredibly important in the history of the 20th century church. And his care for the spirit of the liturgy, Pope Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, wrote a book called The Spirit of the Liturgy. He named that book after Romano Guardini's own book, The Spirit of the Liturgy. Okay? Because of Guardini and Bouillet also talking about the liturgy and how Mass does and does not engage the faithful in the Mass became a topic, a point of concern for the Second Vatican Council Fathers, okay? So I just want you all to be aware of that. Again, that's a narrative thread in that century before the Second Vatican Council. Mass, liturgy, what does it look like? How are we praying? There's this increasing, focus that if we don't get Mass right, if liturgy is not at the center of our lives, we're failing to be truly who we are as Roman Catholics, okay? And that's kind of new. I mean, that's just not exactly how most Christians understood their lives of worship before the start of the 20th century. Okay? Good? All right. Okay, the third topic for today. Time check? Okay. The post-World War II malaise in Europe. This is, frankly, as far as I'm concerned, the most important reality to understand for all of us, okay? Because it runs contrary to our, innate American exceptionalism that we have for ourselves and our own, nostalgia for how things used to be in this country, right? Because we all experienced that. The 20th century was this century of like dynamic growth and in many ways success for the United States. Okay, the United States becomes a world power. The United States becomes this like titanic influence on what the world looks like. The 20th century was the exact opposite for Europe. The 20th century was a complete and total disaster. The utter collapse of society and institution. All of it, okay? 2 world wars, a depression, the effect of the Holocaust. And it's just fascinating to me how I think that simple reality that the 20th century is understood by we Americans today as like a good one for us and by Europeans as a terrible one for them. That's still like driving the heart of controversy like in our church today because I don't think we've ever really come to terms with the fact that for most of the world, the last century wasn't all that great. It just wasn't all that great. It wasn't great for us also in lots of ways, but we tend not to think about them. And again, we have that nostalgic view. So we look back to the 1950s and we just like have like this vision of how things used to be, and they were simpler, weren't they? And families were more together, and there was less violence and crime. Surely, and some of that's true and some of it's not. But even if it's true, it was only true for us. It wasn't true for Europe, and maybe we can gripe about this, but certainly in the mid 20th century, and maybe even now, when you're talking about the Roman Catholic Church, you are talking about Europe, okay? So we just don't matter all that much, So we have to accept that fact. Like in the eyes of the Universal Church, the U.S. is not that high up on the totem pole. I mean, we're just not, and that I think that aggravates us a little bit, The atmosphere of Europe after the Second World War was one of existential hell, okay? Everything was in complete and total destruction. And seemingly no one really knew what to do. Now, I've given you 3 pieces that talk about this. The first is, I think, just a powerful account of the Hiroshima bombing by Pedro Arrupe. I found this about 10 years ago, and this is gut-wrenching and deeply affecting, I think. It's also fascinating because it says here at the beginning, Pedro Arrupe goes on to become the superior of the Jesuit order, okay? The leader of all of the Jesuits. And it's under his leadership that the Jesuits become, what they are today. So whether you love that or hate that, he is a pivotal player in reform within the Jesuit constitution that comes in the late 60s and early 1970s. And we're reading here about what was absolutely a formative influence on his life, to have been a first-hand witness to the horrors of war, okay? And I gave this to you basically so you can get a sense that, none of us experienced war like this. He did. And he is one of millions in Europe who saw horror like this for themselves. And we're trying to make sense of what that means for the world and for church and for God and for their lives. All right? So I don't need to say much more about it. I mean, that's why I said it's short. If you haven't read it, I really recommend it. It's beautiful. It's tragic, okay? It closes on this beautiful reflection on what Christian service demands. So please do, if you can, read it. If you haven't, it's really great. This first chapter, so Karl Rahner writes this book, The Need and Blessing of Prayer. It's not really a book he wrote. It's a series of reflections that he gave in 1951 in Munich, okay? So he is in the center of a bombed-out city, leveled by the Second World War, with much of its population now dead. And he is giving a series of reflections on how is it even possible to have a spiritual life now, okay? So I think this is a beautiful opening chapter to a book on the spiritual life. And for good Lenten reading, again, you can get this probably for $10 on Amazon. $4. Yeah. It's so good. It's also, my class on 20th century Christianity at the seminary, we had to read one spiritual book and write an essay about it. And I picked this book, and I was really glad I did, and I wrote this essay about it, and it was the only not A on the paper I ever received in my life, because the priest professor I had said it was too full of careful analysis and not personal reflection. And I said, you just want me to make more stuff up? So anyway, it's a great book. And he is obviously, if you didn't pick up on this, very much talking about the existential hell of the European soul in the 1950s. Okay, so he talks about on page 3, the rubbled over heart. What an image, okay? What a powerful image. And just this, and here's what really fascinates me. He makes this movement. So on page 3, the top of that concluding paragraph, the rubbled over heart and the opening of the heart. And then listen to these words. The events that occur concretely in our exterior life clearly and manifestly are, when one examines them, often only a sign and a symbol, an external shadow of things that take place in the heart. Perhaps have been taking place for a long time, and now, without anyone's noticing it, they suddenly form the exterior reality of man according to their hidden nature. What Rahner is saying here is that the Second World War and its impact did not necessarily cause a change in the human heart so much as reveal one that had perhaps been there already, but it needed to be torn down in order to come to terms with sort of where Europe was at the time. Does that make sense? Like the Second World War and its horror reveals something that European society had already been experiencing for some time. And then this profoundly beautiful, do you remember the nights in the cellar? The nights of deadly loneliness amidst the harrowing crush of people. It's just an incredible reflection on prayer. And he talks about on page 4, certainly there are people who, as it were, sit innocently and without concern in the cellar of the house of their life. They merrily consume their provisions. Perhaps they still discuss things excitedly. Perhaps they still love and make plans. And they have not yet noticed that the entrance to their cellar has already caved in and is buried under rubble. So it's already out there. And maybe people are faking that they're well, but we aren't well, is his point. We are not spiritually well. And he talks about here on page 5, he says, yes, one has found even a stranger way of making this despair. One says that it is actually the true greatness of man to despair. Only such a despaired one, who has finished and figured out everything and has noticed that behind everything there is nothing, is the true man, who has elevated himself out of the everyday bourgeois, who bravely and honestly professes the only greatness of man that there is, the honest realization of man's nothingness. The greatness of man is the knowledge of his misery. That is a direct rebuke to the rise of existentialist thought that was captivating Europe at the time, which is really important because that impacts Christian theology, and we will get into that in later lectures. But it's where we are in the church at that time. Existentialism is this idea basically there's nothing essential about who we are. Nothing. And the goal in our lives is to just live a life of radical freedom where we just create meaning for ourselves, because nothing regarding meaning or value is given to us by our human nature or by this world, okay? So everything is just up to us. This radical freedom that's grounded in despair about who we are as human persons. And Rahner's responding to that with these reflections on the spiritual life. And he writes here on page 6, because even this Christian life can, everything is possible, belong to a facade, behind which one hides his deadly sickness from the world, and above all from oneself, the sickness unto death, the sickness of secret unbelief, of despair, the paralysis of the interior man who is unable to come out of the prison of this finiteness into the light, into the goodness, into the one free, boundless, exalted above all death, reality of the living God. It's about as good of a sentence as you will ever find. And Rauner's, my point with this is that if we think that the church was doing well before the Second Vatican Council, we should stop thinking that. This tells us something important about the everyday spiritual reality of millions of Christians in the world in the 1950s. And this deeply impacted the life of the church. Does that make sense to you guys? It's just a completely opposite narrative of our 1950s in this country. And I mean it. Like, the 1950s in the United States is an age of spiritual ascendancy, especially for the Roman Catholic Church. Thomas Merton is writing The Seven-Story Mountain, and thousands are flocking to monasteries in a Protestant country. And Fulton Sheen is on television, and no one's ever listened to, a Catholic priest with such authority before. Like, our life in the 1950s is completely different from the life of Roman Catholics in Europe in the 1950s. And that's important for us to understand, okay? So the Second Vatican Council didn't come out of nowhere. It was a response to real challenges on the ground, okay? Are we good there? How are we doing on time? Anybody have time? Quarter of. The new pagans in the church. If we don't go through all of this, we can finish it up next time, because this kind of moves us into theology, and that's where we'll be too. This essay is incredible. If you read this essay, if I just gave this to you, and you read this essay, you might well think, man, like, what blog site did you find that on? Because this world sucks. And this guy, whoever he is, he's on to something. Well, the future Pope Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger, writes this in 1958, okay? So 1958, he gives this lecture, all right? So again, and if you look for continuity between this and what Karl Rahner is writing on the need and blessing of prayer, you'll see a lot of similarities here, similar themes. The church was not well in important ways before the Second Vatican Council. There was this spiritual malaise and lack of sincerity that just made life so hard for the church. So Ratzinger is talking about the new pagans and the church. And I think also, maybe just to bother us Americans, one of the first points he makes is, oh, you think we're talking about what's going on with communism in Russia and China? No, not those pagans. I'm talking about the people next to you at Mass, okay? It's painful. He's talking about us, okay? He's talking about lack of depth and commitment and vitality in our spiritual lives. He says that this phenomenon, okay, in which everyday Roman Catholics lack real faith for themselves, impacts the church in two ways. And this is at the end of the first paragraph on page 2. Therefore, modern man today, when he meets someone else anywhere, can assume with some certainty that he has a baptismal certificate, but not that he has a Christian frame of mind. Welcome to my life, okay? Therefore, he must presume as the normal state of affairs the lack of faith of his neighbor. This is such a profound change. I had a professor yell at us in seminary because if you listen to St. Paul preach in his letters, he is presuming the faith of the audience. And the professor was saying, don't you dare get up there in front of your congregation and presume a lack of faith, because that's not how Scripture works. And sure, but Joey Ratzinger has a couple of really good points to make here, okay? Therefore, he must presume as the normal state of affairs the lack of faith of his neighbor. This fact has two important consequences. So here are the two. On the one hand, it includes a fundamental change in the structure of the church. And on the other hand, it has produced an essential change of consciousness on the side of the still believing Christians. These two phenomena will be clarified in greater detail in this lecture. So, in this lecture that he gives, starting with this next paragraph on page 2 through the middle of page 6, Ratzinger is talking about impact number 1, okay? So, a fundamental change in the structure of the church, all right? And then beginning on the middle of page 6 to the end, he's talking about impact number 2, a change in the consciousness of your everyday Christian in the world, all right? This is really helpful, this essay, because the two impacts that Ratzinger talks about in 1958 end up becoming like vitally important to the Second Vatican Council and what the council ends up talking about. The relationship between church and world, okay, and the relationship of Roman Catholics to Christ, essentially, okay? And sort of like those essential questions or themes are discussed through the lens of such like absolutely important theological realities like who gets saved and how, okay? Ratzinger is talking about all of this in this essay in 1958. He asks a basic question about the life of the church and her sacraments. Who gets to receive the sacraments and what qualifies them for it? Tell me about it, you know? It's hard to sort this out for ourselves. He talks about how there's this, in the very early church, when everybody who becomes Roman Catholic makes that choice for themselves, the church is essentially one of adults who have made the choice of faith for themselves. And then as the church sort of moves through time and culture becomes Christian, people no longer need to make that choice. And so, slowly but surely, it becomes easier to take Christianity for granted. It's just, again, it's the air you're breathing, Like, how grateful are we for all of the things that are so just grounded in reality for us that we don't even notice, That has an impact on how we understand our relationship to God. Ratzinger is essentially saying, in the early church, you would have the sense that I was personally elected. I've personally received grace from God that has called me to an awareness of the truth in Christ that will lead me to the church. Okay? God's called me. I'm going to be a Christian. Once world and church become identified with one another, okay? So to think about life is to think about Christianity, and to think about Europe is to think about Christianity and God, all of it. Once it's all bound up with one another, there was this sense that Ratzinger talks about that, the Western world was chosen, okay? So Christendom has been elected by God, all right, to live with Christ, to spread the faith, all of that, right? But eventually, and this is really important, in the modern world, today, this outward identity of church and world, this is the top of page 3, has remained. But the conviction that in the unchosen belonging to the church, also that a certain divine favor, a heavenly redemption lies hidden, has disappeared. So we get the idea that the church is everywhere, but we don't really think there's anything special about that has to do with God, okay? It's just how history has developed. That makes sense to you guys? Yeah. The next paragraph on page 3 gets at the essential, I call it the essential ecclesiological question. So here's the paragraph. The church is like the world, a datum of our specifically Western existence, and indeed, like the definite world to which we belong, a very contingent reality. So it doesn't need to be, it's sort of the way it is, it's contingent. Almost no one believes seriously that eternal salvation can depend on this very contingent cultural and political reality that we call the church. For the Westerner, the church is, for the most part, nothing more than a very accidental part of the world. Through her externally remaining identity with the world, she has lost the seriousness of her claim. So it is understandable that today, often the question will be asked very urgently whether or not the church should again be turned into a community of conviction in order to confer on her again her great gravity. That would mean that she rigidly abandons the still present worldly positions in order to get rid of an apparent possession which shows itself to be more and more dangerous because it stands in the way of truth. So the basic point here, the more the church has to do with the world, the harder it is for the church to do what church does best and most exclusively, which is like a sacramental life and evangelization. Like if the whole world is all right, if everything out there is more or less okay, why would I go share the gospel? You know, like what am I doing? Why would that matter? You know, that's a question that arises when Christianity is successful in history. You know, in the first century, you spread the gospel because no one knew Christ. What do you do when everybody knows Christ? Casually. You know, what does the life of the church look like? And what do you do when everybody who knows Christ casually doesn't really believe in Christ, but wants to start coming to church still, of course, and have their children baptized, but not do anything about that later in life, right? Like what does the life of the church look like? These are questions that the Second Vatican Council wants to give answers to, okay? This idea, too, I mean, this is very much out there in the world today. Well, we just need to get back down to our reduced core of really believing Christians. Rod Dreher, conservative think piece guy out there on the blogosphere, wrote his book, The Benedict Option, I think 6 years ago now, saying it's time to put up the walls of the monastery, okay? Sever ourselves off from the world, let everything out there crumble. And once they've all destroyed themselves out there, we'll come back out and we'll get to the work of building up the church again. That's an approach, and it's being talked about right here in 1958 by Joseph Ratzinger. This idea. Is that what we're supposed to do? You know, is that how the church will move through time now? Should we just get back to the remnant and go about the work of evangelization? Or can we have anything more to do with the world? The Second Vatican Council is going to tackle those questions directly. All right? I almost want to save the rest of this for next time because it'll be a nice segue into talking about theology. Ratzinger is going to talk about how he's going to draw a list of parallels, essentially. Church and world, okay? Many and few. And then ultimately just Christ and the rest of reality, all right? And sort of the theological and ecclesiological, so church realities that development entails, okay? Those parallels mean, okay? So we can more or less leave it there. I would say, if you haven't read this, I know it's hard, and somebody wrote me and said, you know, what's the point that Ratzinger is trying to make? Fair enough. I don't think he's, you know, it's always, we live in a very litigious culture and argumentative culture. We're always, you know, why do we go out there? Well, to prove our points, you know. I think that in a very European way, which is to say with the use of more language than necessary, Ratzinger isn't trying to make any kind of an argument so much as get clear on the state of affairs. You know, he's basically just trying to identify two essential questions. What should the church look like right now in 1958? And what's going on with your average Christian in 1958? And kind of setting the table for other lectures and other essays and other arguments, okay? But that what he works through, sort of speaking concretely about like the sacramental life of the church in France and also in Germany, beginning on page 3 and through pages 4 and 5, it's really helpful, I think, if you read those paragraphs, you can just take everything he's saying and apply it pretty well to questions I think we're asking about the church in this country right now. Who do we baptize? What do parents need to bring to the table in order for us to baptize their child? What are we asking of Christians in terms of lifelong commitment to their faith? How do we decide who can or can't receive the Eucharist? In 1958, Ratzinger is asking these questions about the church in Europe. We are, in our American mindset, oftentimes thinking, gosh, how do we ever get here? And I think what I want this course to help us understand is that the church has been here for quite a while. We're catching up to something that's just been about 60 or 70 years ahead of Catholicism. So it might be newer to us. It's kind of ancient for Christianity. Okay? Good? So, see you next Saturday.